The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early March, tucked between a seed catalog and a utility bill. It was certified. Marcus Hale signed for it at the mailbox and stood in the gravel drive reading it twice before he walked back inside. The county had completed its wetland delineation review as part of a regional land use update. 62 acres of his 340-acre row crop operation had been reclassified. The map enclosed showed a thick boundary line drawn across the northwest quadrant of his property. Inside that line, wetland designation. The letter explained that the classification was based on hydric soil indicators and remote sensing data. It was not a suggestion. It was a determination, and it changed everything about how that ground could be used. Marcus set the letter on the kitchen table next to the aerial map that had come folded inside the envelope. He smoothed it flat with both hands and looked at the line. 62 acres. He did the math before he called anyone. That's how he operated. Numbers first, then questions. The Northwest Block had been running corn and soybeans in rotation for as long as he had farmed it. In a normal year, that ground averaged 185 bushels of corn per acre. At current prices, 62 acres of corn ground produces somewhere between $22,000 and $26,000 in gross revenue annually, depending on input costs and yield variation. After expenses, the net contribution from that block ran roughly $14,000 to $17,000 per year. Not the margin that made the operation, but not nothing either. More significant was the land value question. Agricultural ground in his county was trading between $8,500 and $9,200 per acre for productive cropland. Wetland-designated acreage did not carry that value. Depending on restrictions, wetland parcels in the region were moving at $1,800 to $3,000 per acre, sometimes less if development was restricted and farming was prohibited. Run that against 62 acres, and the math was stark. The difference between productive cropland value and wetland value on that one block represented somewhere between $370,000 and $450,000 in paper asset loss. That number sat on the table alongside the map. Marcus looked out the window at the northwest block. It didn't look like a wetland. He walked it the next morning. March ground is cold and wet in most years, but this was a dry spring. He moved across the 62 acres in a systematic pattern, north end to south, back across the middle, then along the west boundary. He was looking for cattails, standing water, water-stained vegetation, hydrophytic plant species, the visual markers most people associate with wetland. He found none of it. The field had been fall-tilled. The surface was uniform. The drainage pattern moved water west toward the county ditch at the property edge. There was no ponding, no saturated soil visible on the surface. He pulled a soil probe from his jacket pocket and pushed cores at 6 locations across the block. The soil was moist from spring thaw, but at depth it was firm. No glaying, no obvious mottling in the upper profile that he could see without a lab. He stood at the center of the 62 acres and turned a full circle. Nothing here looked like a wetland. That, he would learn, was not the point. He requested a meeting with the County Soil and Water Conservation District Office the following week. The delineator who had conducted the review was a methodical man named Brandt, mid-40s, practical in his speech, not hostile. He pulled up the technical file and walked Marcus through the classification rationale. The determination had been made using 2 overlapping data sets. First, the county soils survey, which mapped the northwest block as Colo silty clay loam and Zook silty clay loam, both classified as hydric soil series. Hydric soils are defined by the Natural Resources Conservation Service as soils that formed under conditions of saturation, flooding, or ponding long enough during the growing season to develop anaerobic conditions in the upper part. The presence of hydric soil series alone is one of the 3 indicators used to establish wetland, the others being hydrophytic vegetation and wetland hydrology. Second, the classification incorporated a satellite-based analysis that used multi-year remote sensing data to identify surface reflectance patterns consistent with seasonal inundation. The overlay showed the northwest block carrying moisture signatures that aligned with wetland hydrology indicators across multiple growing seasons. Brant was clear. The classification was not based on what the field looked like today. It was based on what the soil type was and what the satellite record showed over time. Marcus asked about drainage. He explained that the field had been tiled. Brant nodded. He knew.
But he explained that tile drainage does not automatically reclassify hydric soil. Soil series classification is based on the soil's inherent formation history, not its current managed condition. A drained hydric soil is still a hydric soil. Marcus drove home, thinking about that distinction. Classification versus use. The soil was what it had always been. What mattered, apparently, was when it had been converted, and whether there was documentation to prove it. He almost accepted it. That is worth saying directly. There was a week in late March where Marcus was close to filing the acknowledgement form the county had included with the letter, a form that would confirm he had received and understood the designation. He had spoken to his attorney, who told him the review process was legitimate and that fighting a soil series classification was difficult. He had spoken to a neighboring farmer who had received a similar letter 2 years prior and had eventually accepted a conservation easement on the affected ground. The county's process was not corrupt. It was not careless. It had followed established technical procedure. The form sat on his desk for 8 days. Then he remembered 1981. His father had put tile in that northwest block in the fall of 1981. Marcus had been 11 years old. He remembered the tile Plow because it was the largest piece of equipment that had ever operated on their ground. A hydraulic plow that cut a narrow trench and laid perforated plastic pipe in a single pass. His father had talked about it for months beforehand. The soil in that block had always been wet in spring. The low ground in the northwest corner would pond for weeks after snowmelt. Corn planted there was always late. Emergence was uneven. Yield dragged the whole farm average down. The tiling job had cost his father $14,600 in 1981 dollars. Lateral lines every 66 feet across the entire block. A main collector running to the west boundary and into the county ditch. 4-inch laterals, 6-inch main. Installed to a depth of 36 to 42 inches across the field. After tiling, that block had produced like the rest of the farm. His father said it was one of the best investments he ever made in the ground. Marcus went to the barn. His father had been a keeper of paper. The filing cabinet in the corner of the equipment barn, a green 2-drawer metal unit with a broken handle on the top drawer, had been there since Marcus was a child. His father had put everything in it. Receipts, seed invoices, chemical records, land survey notes, insurance documents. Marcus had gone through it when his father passed 11 years ago, but he had not cleared it. He'd kept it because it was easier to keep than to decide what to discard. He pulled the bottom drawer first, behind a manila folder of 1988 crop insurance documents, behind a rubber-banded stack of fertilizer receipts from the late 1990s. Behind a folded county plat map from 1976, he found a flat cardboard tube. Inside the tube was a rolled tile installation drawing, a hand-drafted field map showing the northwest block with every lateral line sketched in pencil, numbered, annotated with spacing and depth. In the bottom corner, a date, October 1981, a contractor's name, DeKalb Drainage Services, a job number. Behind the tube, in a plain envelope, was the invoice. $14,600. Paid in full. Date stamped November 7th, 1981. Marcus sat on the barn floor with those papers in his hands. He took them inside and photographed every page. He returned to the county office with the tile map and invoice. He submitted copies formally and requested that the drainage history be considered in the wetland determination review. He believed, based on what he had read about federal wetland policy, that there was a category called prior converted cropland that might apply to his situation. Prior converted cropland is a specific designation under federal wetland policy, particularly relevant under the Food Security Act of 1985 and its subsequent amendments. It refers to wetlands that were converted to agricultural use before December 23, 1985, the federal cutoff date established by the swamp buster provisions of that legislation. Agricultural land that was drained and in crop production before that date may qualify as prior converted cropland, meaning federal wetland protections do not apply in the same way they do to wetlands converted after the cutoff. The 1981 tile installation, if it could be verified, predated the federal cutoff by 4 years. Brandt reviewed the submission. He was not dismissive. He consulted with the regional NRCS office. 3 weeks later, he sent a written response. The response acknowledged the documentation. It acknowledged that the drainage installation predated the federal cutoff year, but it raised a point Marcus had not anticipated. The county's classification for local land use purposes was not bound exclusively by federal prior converted cropland standards. The local ordinance used the NRCS hydric soil list as a primary indicator, and the county had independent authority to designate land use classification based on soil characteristics. The prior converted cropland argument was relevant to federal program eligibility, specifically crop insurance, FSA program payments, and USDA wetland conservation compliance. But the county's zoning adjacent designation used a different regulatory framework. Additionally, Brandt noted that while the tile map was compelling, the county required verification that the drainage system was still functional and had been continuously maintained. A drainage system installed in 1981 that had failed or been abandoned would not sustain a prior converted cropland claim. Marcus read the email 3 times. The map had not been enough. History had to be proven continuously, not just at a point in time. He almost stopped there. The second near defeat was quieter than the first. There was no dramatic moment. He simply sat in his truck at the end of the field lane one evening and looked at the 62 acres in the last light and thought about whether the cost of continuing, in time, in legal fees, in energy, was worth the outcome. The county was not wrong that the process was complex. He was a farmer, not a bureaucrat. He knew how to manage ground, not how to navigate administrative procedure. He called his attorney the next morning and told him to keep going. The tile map was the anchor, but it wasn't enough on its own. Marcus began building a secondary evidence file. He requested aerial photography from the USDA Farm Service Agency for his parcel going back to the earliest available imagery. The FSA maintains historical aerial photos for agricultural land across much of the country. The earliest images Marcus could obtain were from 1982 and 1985. Both showed the northwest block in a clearly cultivated, row-cropped condition. Uniform field patterns, no ponding visible, no irregular vegetation breaks. The 1985 image, taken just before the federal cutoff year, showed clean crop rows across the entire 62-acre block. He located a retired employee of DeKalb Drainage Services, the contractor listed on the 1981 invoice, through a county agricultural directory. The man, now in his mid-70s, kept a ledger from his working years. He found the job number. He confirmed the installation. He wrote a signed statement on plain paper describing the scope of work and the date. Marcus also pulled his father's FSA farm records from the county office, records showing continuous program enrollment and crop reporting for the Northwest Block through the 1980s and 1990s. The field had been reported as cropland in every available filing year. He assembled all of it: tile map, invoice, FSA aerial photos, contractor statement, farm program records, into a single, organized submission packet. He delivered it in person to the county office and requested a formal review hearing. 10 days before the hearing, his bank called. Marcus had a $380,000 operating line secured in part against his land base. The loan officer, whom Marcus had worked with for 6 years, had received the county's designation update through a routine title and collateral review process. The 62-acre reclassification had triggered an internal flag. The bank needed to understand the status of the designation before the next renewal cycle. It was not a threat. It was a procedural question, but the question was clear. If the 62 acres were formally classified as restricted wetland, the bank would need to reassess collateral values, which could affect the terms or availability of the operating line. Marcus explained the review process. The loan officer noted the timeline. He said the bank would hold the renewal 90 days pending resolution of the classification question. 90 days. The hearing was scheduled in 6 weeks. The county convened a technical review panel to hear Marcus's evidence. The panel included a county planner, a soil scientist from the regional NRCS office, and a representative from the State Department of Agriculture's drainage program. Marcus was permitted to present his documentation and have a licensed soil consultant speak on his behalf. The consultant, a woman named Dr. Elaine Carr, a certified professional soil scientist with 22 years of field experience, walked the panel through the evidence systematically. She began with the hydric soil question. She confirmed that the soil series present in the northwest block, Colo and Zook silty clay loam, were indeed listed as hydric soils. She did not dispute the county's soil science. What she addressed was the condition of the soil under current and historical drainage management. She presented core samples taken at 6 locations across the block, showing drainage patterns consistent with a functional tile system. She noted the absence of current wetland hydrology indicators despite spring thaw conditions. She then addressed the prior converted cropland framework, not as a local zoning argument, but as a federal program eligibility standard that she argued the county's own technical determination should consider as a parallel data point. She walked the panel through the federal definition. Wetlands converted to cropland prior to December the 23rd, 1985, that have been maintained in agricultural production. She presented the 1981 tile map, the 1981 invoice, the FSA aerial photos from 1982 and 1985, the contractor's signed statement, the continuous farm program enrollment records. She made one central argument. The county's designation relied on hydric soil classification and satellite moisture data. But satellite moisture data can reflect managed drainage conditions that temporarily exceed tile capacity during extreme precipitation events. Multi-year reflectance data showing seasonal moisture signatures is not the same as demonstrating wetland hydrology under the full 3-factor test. The vegetation factor had never been met. The hydrology factor was ambiguous given the drainage history. The soil factor alone, she argued, was insufficient for a full wetland determination on ground with this documentation record. The panel asked questions for 40 minutes. Grant, sitting at the side of the table, answered several of them and at one point confirmed that the drainage documentation submitted was the most complete he had seen in a contested review during his tenure. The panel did not make a decision that day. 3 weeks passed. Marcus checked his email every morning before he did anything else. On a Thursday in late May, the response came from the county planning office. The panel had completed its review. The determination was as follows. The full 62-acre wetland designation could not be sustained under the 3-factor wetland test, given the evidence of pre-1985 drainage conversion and continuous agricultural use. However, the county could not fully remove the designation from the entire block. The northwest corner of the block, Approximately 8 acres containing the lowest elevations and the area with the most consistent multi-year satellite moisture signature would retain a modified wetland buffer designation. Restrictions on that portion would be limited in scope. No fill, no structures, but continued row crop production would be permitted under a reviewed plan. The remaining 54 acres would be reclassified back to productive agricultural land. The wetland designation would be lifted. 54 acres restored, 8 acres in a modified buffer category. It was not a full reversal, it was a partial correction. The county had followed its process. Marcus had followed his. The documentation had moved the line. He called the bank that afternoon. He forwarded the county's written determination. The loan officer confirmed the collateral review could proceed on the restored classification. The operating line renewal would move forward on normal terms. Marcus drove out to the northwest block that evening. He parked at the field entrance and walked the ground without pulling a probe or carrying anything. He walked to the northwest corner, the 8 acres that would carry the modified buffer designation, and stood there for a few minutes. It was low. It always had been. His father had known it was the difficult part of that block even after tiling. The tile had improved it substantially, but the lowest corner had always been the last to dry in spring. He walked back across the 54 acres that had been restored. The ground was firm. The tile was working. The corn would go in on time. Here is what this situation actually comes down to, and it is worth being direct about it. The county did not make an error driven by carelessness or bad faith. They applied a technical classification process using current soils data and satellite analysis. That process identified hydric soil series and moisture patterns consistent with wetland indicators. The designation followed the procedure. It was reasonable on the face of the available data. What the county's initial process did not account for was the physical history of that ground. Because physical history requires documentation, and documentation is not automatic. It has to be filed, maintained, and retrievable. A tile map from 1981, an invoice with a date stamp, aerial photographs from a federal archive, a retired contractor's ledger, farm program enrollment records. None of those things are glamorous. None of them announce themselves as important at the moment they're created. A receipt for drainage work, filed in a metal cabinet in a barn for 42 years, does not feel like a legal document. But when a satellite draws a line across your land and labels 62 acres as wetland, that receipt is exactly what the argument runs on. Land value can change with a line on paper. Classification is technical. History is physical. Documentation outlasts memory. The 8 acres in the northwest corner, Marcus accepted those, not because the county was right about all of it, but because the evidence for that specific portion was thinner. The tile drainage reached it, but the natural drainage pattern in that corner had always fought the system. His father had said as much. Some ground is what it is, regardless of what you put in it. 54 acres came back. That represented, at current valuations, roughly $460,000 in restored land asset value. The annual income contribution from those 54 acres in productive rotation was preserved. The 8 acres in the modified buffer would still produce. Restrictions were limited. The loss there was real but manageable. The question this situation raises for any farmer carrying older ground is straightforward. Do you know what was done to your land before you farmed it? And can you prove it? Drainage installation records, tile maps, contractor invoices, aerial photographs from the 1970s and 1980s available through FSA, farm program enrollment records going back to the mid-1980s. These are the documents that define land improvement history. They are the difference between a classification that holds and one that can be technically challenged. The federal prior converted cropland framework exists because Congress recognized in 1985 that agricultural land already in production before that date occupied a different legal category than undrained wetlands. But the framework does not apply automatically. It applies when the history can be demonstrated, when the drainage can be dated, when the conversion can be proven to predate the cutoff. Would you have known to look for those records? Would you have known where to file them? How many farmers in this county, in any county running ground that was tiled before 1985, have their documentation in a place they can find it? They drew a line from a satellite. He redrew it with history. The corn went in the second week of June, a little behind schedule. The northwest block planted clean. 62 acres, the same as always, moving through the planter in the same passes his father had driven 40 years before. The line on the map had shifted. 54 acres on one side, 8 acres on the other. Not a perfect outcome, a documented one. Marcus filed the final county determination letter in the green metal cabinet in the equipment barn, in a new folder he labeled clearly with the parcel number, the year, and the words, Wetland Review, resolved. Then he went back to work. If this story raised questions about your own land records or drainage history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to follow more stories about land, documentation, and the decisions that define farm operations, subscribe. The next one matters too.